Hello, viewers and listeners, and welcome to episode 7 of the Phoenix Cast. My name is Em.
And I'm Megan.
And today we are going to be talking about who is forgiveness for. Before we jump into that, I want to give a little bit of a recap over our last episode. So once again, we're going to be discussing Unorthodox, Netflix's Unorthodox miniseries. And last episode, we talked about how do we define assault and why do some people maybe not define their experiences as assault? And then why did we in particular feel that Estee's particular situation as portrayed in the Netflix miniseries was assault? For us, we found that there wasn't really the presence of consent, that there was definitely coercion, both on an individual and systemic level. And then we also talked about how we can't determine whether or not assault is assault for anyone, right? But the reason that we were able to for this particular set of circumstances within the miniseries was because it is a fictionalized account. But we also discussed when it came to, for instance, Deborah's memoir, which was the source material for this miniseries, that we wouldn't be able to make any determinations about her personal experience. That's something that only she can do. And in fact, we are not really even provided with that information within the memoir. So I wanted to jump in and go ahead and define forgiveness. So we're going to be talking a lot about the concept of forgiveness. And I think that forgiveness as a whole is a really interesting concept because oftentimes we see it used to guilt survivors. At least that's been my experience within mainstream media. Megan, what's your experience been with forgiveness before we dive in and define?
Honestly, it's a huge concept. And it's something that I think, especially in the context of abuse, is something that a lot of survivors feel like they have to do, or they have to get there, or or on the flip side, that if they do reach a point of forgiveness, that they're somehow condoning what happened to them or what someone has done. And I think that for me, the biggest thing that we have to, piece apart is that forgiveness does not necessarily mean that you're saying it's okay, or you're saying that it never happened, or the whole forgive and forget thing doesn't exist, really. What I did want to take a moment, though, to say, if it's okay, is I think that, we have to be cognizant of the fact that we don't release this podcast in a vacuum. And there's a lot going on in the world right now. And I know you're going to unpack that in another one of our podcasts coming up. So I'm not going to get too far into it, but I want to say specifically that as we're speaking about forgiveness today, we're speaking specifically about the concept of forgiveness as it applies to experiences of interpersonal violence between usually two people, right? At least in this explanation. And that what we're talking about with regards to forgiveness is not necessarily something that can be taken and applied elsewhere.
Thank you. And yes, Thank you for also clarifying that interpersonal level as well. So we're going to go ahead and define forgiveness. So forgiveness is the personal process of deciding to not continue to hold on to your anger, resentment, and thoughts of revenge. Letting go of the anger does not change the fact that the abusive behaviors were wrong, but rather it can create an enormous positive shift for you mentally and emotionally.
I really love that definition. Where did you pull it from again?
It may have been the National Domestic Violence Coalition.
That was it.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. So I really, really, really love this definition because in the context of relationship violence, I really appreciate that it's focusing on the person who's experienced the harm and not about assuaging the guilt of the person who has perpetrated harm. It's not about coddling that person, or even, with survivors of intimate partner violence and relationship violence and interpersonal violence and many violences. Oftentimes folks are victimized by systems as well. And forgiveness with systems is a totally different ballgame, because how can you really forgive a system? But what I really also like about this is that it acknowledges that anger is exhausting.
Yeah, it is. Anger is an active process, right? Like, even if it's not something that you're thinking about actively on a regular basis, it is something that your brain is actively engaging with. Spending all of those brain cells all of the time on that feeling of anger, that feeling of resentment, or that feeling of hurt. There's a time and a place for it, and it is valid. It is so incredibly valid. And I do think you get to a point where you're just like, I don't want to carry this around anymore.
Right. Right. Absolutely. It takes up a lot of energy. And sometimes for survivors, that energy can be really useful for a time and for a place. But eventually someone may, in their journey, decide that energy is not how they want to expend that. They want to shift that somewhere else. And I think it's also important to remember that just like healing isn't linear, this isn't like a clear cycle either. I know many survivors who, it's been 10 years since they've experienced an assault, and for the most part, they don't really experience a lot of anger around it anymore. But then maybe one day they wake up and you're like, I'm just pissed today. I am pissed about the things that I've experienced, and this is just the day I am going to let myself feel that. And so I also want to mention that and make sure that there's room for that, because day to day, you never really know what's going to happen. And especially even if you have been processing your triggers and your trauma for a decade, sometimes something happens and it'll put you right back where you thought you had been so far from.
Absolutely.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, I was just thinking, I often talk about trauma like an onion, right? Insofar as it's layered, right? Like you work on one piece and you get through that, and then you work on another piece and you get through that. I don't know if I would necessarily call it an infinite onion, but it certainly feels that way a lot of time. To your point, you can cope, you can let go of layer after layer after layer after layer, and you think you're good, and then something happens, like you said, and you're just like, oh, there's still more. Great.
There was also a really great quote that I think kind of wraps up what we like about that. And you said it was from one of your favorite authors. Could you remind me?
Bless Annie Lamott. She is a wonderful, amazing writer. Read everything she writes ever. She said in one of her books, actually back in '99, in her book, Traveling Mercies, she says specifically, not forgiving is like drinking rat poison and expecting the rat to die. Once you have the initial feelings and the valid feelings of anger and hurt and resentment have kind of burnt out, and you're just left with this smoldering pile of gross, holding on to that it's more harmful to you individually as a person than it is somehow vengeful or harmful to the person who harmed you. And at that point, I think you get to a point where you're ready to say, I don't need to carry this burden anymore.
I think something that we should probably also clarify is that, before we get into the SD situation, for folks who are looking to practice forgiveness actively with someone who has harmed them, that may not be a safe situation for every person. I don't want to say that no perpetrator is ever capable of accountability, because I firmly believe that if we give people the tools and the information and the education, we as a society can do better than what we're currently experiencing with all the different types of violences on a interpersonal and systemic level.
Yes.
And if someone is not interested in accountability, then that forgiveness process is probably going to hurt you a lot more than it is going to help you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, especially if the forgiveness process that you're talking about involves that other person.
Mm-hmm.
Right, because sometimes it's just a matter of, I say just like it's easy. Sometimes it's a matter of an internal or a personal process that a person works on their own, or with their therapist, or with close friends, or whatever. But you're right, sometimes it is a very specific redemptive process where you want to confront the person, or you want to talk to them, you want some kind of apology or something like that. I think it's important to remember when we're thinking about that you can't totally control that situation. So there's another human being who is involved in a process like that, who may have their own thoughts and feelings and ideas, and may not be interested in what you have to say or what you're needing.
Awesome. So thank you for engaging kind of with some of those nuances before we even really dive into the specific situation.
We should rename our podcast The Nuances of Everything.
It's the name of my memoir. Let's kind of dive into the larger question of what we came away with in that last episode of Unorthodox. So we kind of talked about, what do you do when your perpetrator seeks redemption? Because that's kind of what we saw when Yankee cuts off his Payos. So I'm
Mhm.
going to let Megan kind of describe that moment so she can also provide a cultural context of like why cutting off the Payos is so significant.
Yeah, it absolutely is. So just very quick, what are Payus, right? You're fine.
That's
It's
my
spelled Payos for anybody who's looking at it. That's how it's spelled. Probably people say Payos somewhere. There's a lot of variation depending on where you grew up and whatnot. But I learned to say Payas. So Payas, the reason that Orthodox men have Payas is because there is a line in the Torah that says that a man may not shave the corners of his head or his beard, and that's just how that was interpreted originally. And so that's where you see like the really long, really beautiful, to be honest, curls that they have. They don't all naturally have curls. Many of them curl their payas, just in case anyone was wondering, because I was at one point in time. And the payas are like a very outward symbol of piety and of honoring God's law as they see it, right? So when we go into this moment with Yankee and Esty in the hotel room, and Yankee seems desperate and seems like he doesn't really, he wants to understand what she's mad about and what is making her want to not be with him anymore. And he kind of one-dimensionally assumes that she's just mad at the religion as a whole. And so he cuts off his payas, which is huge, right? Because they grow them from like the time they're itty bitty as like like I can do this, like I can forsake my religion too, if that's what you want for me, if that's what you want me to do. What I think is really important about that moment, right, is like it's heartbreaking, and it is okay to feel sad that he feels so desperate, and to have empathy for him and his position in that moment. That being said, I think where he misses, and where a lot of people miss when we start talking about asking for forgiveness, is the intention. I think this is a moment where he maybe starts to recognize that there's growth that he needs to do, but the way that he sets it up and the way that he cuts off his payas and whatever, it's very much like, I'll do this for you. When we're talking about an amount of personal growth that needs to be undertaken to be a better person, like, to be clear, that's what we're really talking about here. That's a journey that needs to be taken for the self and with the self, as opposed to for someone else. It's not going to take if it's for someone else, and it will only breed resentment.
Right. And so at that point, it's just, it feels like too little too late.
Yes.
That Yankee, he understands that the society that they've lived in is not comfortable for Esty. And it's not, I think maybe in that moment, he sort of understands a little better what she means by what she had said at the start. It's like, I'm different. And it feels completely symbolic, right? Like we don't actually see any of his behavior change.
Yeah.
And he doesn't even say like, I am going to unlearn like how I have oppressed you and ignored your consent, and how I am like, towing the party line. Yankee is pushed to the edge of his comfort, and he doesn't take the leap of staying there, it feels like. He's like, this is what I can do right now, and maybe this is enough, but I'm not going to talk about anything long lasting.
Yeah. Well, and I think like what he's searching for in that moment is like, what's the thing? Is there a thing that I can do in this moment to make it better? Right. And as a person in the world, right, who certainly has enacted harm unintentionally, but I've done it, right? Like I can appreciate it. Right. I feel everyone has. I feel like I can empathize with that, like, oh God, I feel so awful and gross. And like, what can I do right now in this moment to make it better? And what I think is important to recognize is that instinct is selfish.
Absolutely.
Right? That instinct is, what can I do to make it better right now so I can stop feeling so uncomfortable? Right? Me, not you.
How do I seek redemption without actually addressing the harm I've caused to you, without taking steps to both say that you're sorry, talk about how you'll never do it again, and not just how you'll never do it again, but like, what are the steps you will take to unlearn the behavior that you've enacted?
Which
Like,
is so interesting because you're actually almost right on it, right? That the Jewish idea of an apology is that, like
yes.
a Jewish apology. It's a thing, first of all.
Which, do you mind if I cut in really quickly? Because I'm really
Please.
excited about this point. Because
Yes.
this is the thing that I'm really excited for you to explain like the makeup of a Jewish apology. Because at the end of the day, like it's so interesting. Like Yankee, for as pious as he tries to be,
Uh-huh.
is in direct opposition to Jewish law.
Mm-hmm. Yes, he is, which is why it's so fascinating. So a Jewish apology has three parts, okay? And it starts with the actual physical words, right? I'm sorry, or I apologize, or whatever variation on the theme you want to go with. The second part is acknowledging the harm that you have caused, whether you intended to cause harm or not. You are expected to acknowledge the harm that you caused. And the third part is to take steps to do better and to not repeat the offense. Your apology is not complete, and you are therefore not entitled to forgiveness. And it says this very specifically in law. You are not entitled to forgiveness until such time as you have completed all three parts of that apology. So I think the very simplistic way that we teach apology, which makes sense developmentally, I get it, of like, I'm sorry, it's okay, I forgive you, hug it out, go back to the playground, basically, is not it doesn't translate to adult life at all. And it shouldn't, because that's not an apology. That's just a social nicety.
It's a band-aid. Because at the end
Yeah.
of the day, like if we teach
If
children
that.
that's yeah, if that, at the end of the day, if we're teaching our young people and the kids are in our society that all it takes to be forgiven is an I'm sorry, people are going to feel a lot more entitled, and I believe that they do, to enact harm and then just apologize for it later.
Yeah.
Kind of like, absolutely. And we know that there's not actually like any intention of taking accountability behind that statement. And I think this is definitely a systemic issue that we see throughout our society, especially when it comes to like boys will be boys rhetoric. I think that in a lot of ways it's very similar of like boys will be boys, he'll apologize, but like you get it, like he's not responsible. We also send these very gendered messages about like what happens when men perpetrate harm too, like from birth.
Yep.
So like Yankee feels like he can just apologize and it'll be fine, and he loves her, and that's all that's needed. But at the end of the day, like, does he even really love her? If at the end of the day, we talked about in the last episode, does he even know her?
No, he doesn't. He doesn't know her. He doesn't, I think he likes, perhaps even loves the idea of her, the concept of her, but I don't think he knows her well enough to love her. Right. So I can see that being like an argument, so to speak, if when you were saying like, well, like the Payus thing, it's not enough. And people saying, oh, but it's so clear from that moment that he loves her. No, I disagree. I think it's so clear from that moment that he doesn't want to be uncomfortable anymore, and that he wants his life to go back to what he thought it was going to be, that he may very genuinely feel a sense of loss over the fact that he knows that she's pregnant and he won't have a part in this child's life, or won't at the very least have the part that he thought he was going to have. What's really interesting, I think, too, about this whole idea of Yankee not knowing her, right, is that he doesn't even seem to necessarily understand that he's supposed to.
Right. This was
right?
this is something that you brought up about Jewish sexuality and laws around like a Jewish sex life.
Yeah.
Which is a statement I never really thought I'd say.
Fascinating.
Are very specific in the Torah. I had no idea how detailed it was.
Oh yeah, it's detailed. Judaism is more progressive on the understanding of sexuality and its purpose, though ultra-Orthodox and Orthodoxy, even some conservative synagogues, are not so with the times or with, correctness, in that they are not necessarily open to the spectrum of sexuality itself. But the teachings and the writings about kosher sex are different from a lot of other monotheistic religions in that, yes, its purpose is procreation, but its purpose is not solely procreation. And it talks very specifically about its purpose is, to strengthen the marriage bond and to keep, your partner happy. What's super interesting is that it says very specifically that sex is a woman's right, not a man's, which is interesting. But specifically to the point that we're making, the Jewish word that is used for sex in the Torah comes from the root yada, which means to know, which is just so interesting because that so vividly explains that Jewish sexuality is about not just the body, but also the heart and the mind and the soul. And Yanki hasn't taken the time or even thought to do so to learn about her heart and her mind and her soul, right? He sees her body and the struggle they had consummating their marriage as almost a personal affront, I would say.
Yeah.
And doesn't even necessarily seem to understand, like, you're supposed to understand your partner. And I think we see this in the first or second episode when they're sitting down at the table and they're like, where would she go? And he's like, I don't know. And they're like, she's your wife. Like, why don't you understand this information? And he's like, oh, I was supposed to get to know her. No one told me that. Like, it very much has that feeling.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things that we talked about is it's almost like a self-preserving tactic of like, he doesn't know how to engage with her. He doesn't try to, because then there's no stakes for him. Like there's no risk, right? Like he's done everything that he's supposed to do, and knowing her would put his comfortable life where he knows exactly what his privileges are in danger. And that's why I also feel like the Payus is so symbolic, right? I don't think at the end of the day, like hair grows back. And I think at the end of the day, like his privilege will almost grow back. Mm-hmm. And that what he's trying to do is get his wife back to Williamsburg so that he can grow his privilege back.
I love the way you put that. I love that idea, right? Because you really highlight the like temporary nature of the symbolic choice he made. You are absolutely right. Hair grows back. And there is some cultural shame around having short payas as an adult, but at the same time, who's going to punish him for that? He's going to go back to Williamsburg and he's going to say, yeah, I did this thing. I was trying to get back my wife. And they're going to go, bad on her for not coming back with you. Like there's nothing, there's no stakes to this thing that he's done, with the exception of, spiritually, sure, like it means something to him, but it is a temporary step.
Yeah. And another aspect that we talked about as well is Esty is in such a different place at this point. Yeah. Like Esty has been in Berlin for, I guess it's really like only a few days or a week, but it feels like forever, because she has gone through this like jumpstart growth, right? Like, and I view it as like when she goes to that lake and she sheds her more modest clothing, and she still stays pretty clothed, but she removes her wig and she's like letting go of almost like the harm that was perpetrated against her by Yanki and by her community, and trying to start over and trying to reclaim her life.
And reclaim her, right? I think she had buried so much of her natural being and her personality and who she is and what's important to her and how she wants to do things, because none of that aligned with the requirements of her community. It's honestly almost like the lake functions as its own like mikveh for her. It's like it cleanses her and purifies her from the mask that she was wearing and the person she was trying to be, and she comes out of that lake more her than she's ever been.
I love the way you put that. I definitely agree. And it's so heartbreaking to watch Esty in this moment, right? Like, because I think her heart is kind of breaking too. And her heart is breaking and it's still not enough, right? And I think that perfectly summarizes that it's never a survivor's responsibility to make it okay or comfortable. Even if you feel for your perpetrator, it still isn't your responsibility.
Nope.
And that goes beyond interpersonal violence too. And I also want to talk about righteous anger too, because I do think when we talk about anger and forgiveness, I don't want to make it sound like we're absolutely against anger, because righteous anger is so helpful and vital. It is what has led so many movements to secure the rights of marginalized peoples.
It's how you get it done.
Yes, it absolutely does. When it comes to forgiveness, and something that I'm seeing a lot right now with the police brutality that is being spotlighted in our country right now, the deaths of Black folks who are being targeted by police and vigilantes. It is never the responsibility of the Black community to educate and to make white folks and non-Black people feel comfortable about what's going on.
Yeah.
So if you're feeling comfortable watching and listening and observing everything that's going on in this country, watching the deadly environment that Black Americans live in, you need to sit with that discomfort and also stop maybe co-opting Martin Luther King quotes and actually understand that riots are truly the language of the unheard and that there is no nonviolence in a violent system. How can you respond to a violent, deadly system purely with nonviolence? So I want to say that this is something that we're happy to talk about individually and that we will be continuing to talk about, because another thing is that you cannot end interpersonal violence without first reckoning with racial justice and racial violence and the long, long history of racialized sexual violence that Black and Indigenous folks have lived with. So I do want to say that.
Yes, I'm glad you did.
I want to let that lie there. I think is really, really important because, like you said at the beginning of this episode, we're not discussing this in a vacuum. We, as much as we're like, this is a fictionalized story and we get to make decisions about this, I also recognize that there's a lot going on within the United States and within the globe. You know, anti-Blackness is global.
Yes, it is.
And then forgiveness is in the eye of the survivor, and it's never owed in any situation.
I think I've seen something, just to, first of all, thank you for saying all of that. There's nothing I can add. I think that something that I've seen sort of pivoting back to interpersonal violence, something that I've seen happen a lot between when it's intimate partner violence or when it's violence between people who had any kind of pre-existing friendship, relationship, anything, is the perpetrator or the person who's caused harm will often say, like, well, how long are you going to punish me? As if like forgiveness, withholding forgiveness is about them, and two, a punishment, which it's not. And that puts that onus on the survivor. Like, it's your job to make what I did to harm you okay. Like, you're the only person that can tell me that I'm okay now. And I think that misses the fact that if you've caused harm, you don't necessarily deserve to be okay. Like, that sounds like a very harsh thing to say. And when you embrace the idea that it's not, you don't get to be okay if you're the person that caused harm, you grow.
Absolutely.
Right? There have been a lot of situations, plenty of situations in my own life where I have caused harm and wanted so badly for someone just to tell me it was okay and that it was fine and it wasn't my fault, or that, you know, everything was okay now. And I wasn't getting it, and I was frustrated at first, and then I was just like, okay, like I gotta go do better. I gotta go learn, and I gotta go do better. And in that, like, I lived my way into the forgiveness and into the respect and the trust of the people that I had previously harmed, because I was showing them that last part of that apology. It's okay. You can be mad at me. I'm not like I get the opportunity and the ability to, you know, sanction your anger, but like, I'm going to stop asking for you to make this okay for me, and I'm going to go make it okay for myself, because making it okay means growing and doing better.
Yeah, and it's almost like it has to be living. An apology has to be living.
Yes.
It has to be an active process, and it never ends.
Yeah.
Because something that I know is that, and something that we both know, is that when things get hard, people also fall on bad habits. They always go back to bad habits. So just because you've taken accountability and maybe your behavior has changed in the future, that doesn't mean that it's like, whoosh, don't have to think about that issue anymore. Got that solved. Like, that is absolutely not how it works, because the minute you get lazy, you are going to start harming folks again.
Yes. It's an investment, and it's an investment in yourself. And in that way, like, I think embracing the fact that someone has the righteous ability to be angry at you and examining that and figuring out what you did and how to make it better, maybe not for them, maybe not for that relationship, but make yourself better, is in fact an act of self-love.
the best way to love others and yourself is to take accountability and to live your values, right? Like it can't just be, I'm going to say this thing and I'm not actually going to walk the talk. It has to be, I've caused harm. I understand what I've done now to the best of my ability. And here are some steps I'm taking. And here is how I plan to do better.
Mm-hmm. And that survivor gets to decide for themselves when and if they're ready to let go. And you may never know. And that's okay.
You have to sit with that. You have to sit with not knowing. Because I also think a lot of people don't really realize that even though trauma can be processed and you can learn to live with a variety of circumstances and develop coping mechanisms to deal with it, it doesn't mean it goes away, right? Like exactly what you said at the beginning. It's not forgive and forget. People do carry trauma with them everywhere. And it is released sometimes at the most inconvenient of times.
Oh, yeah.
Right? Like you could be in the middle of like a yoga class. This is something we hear a lot because of how trauma lives in the body. And suddenly you're in the middle of downward dog and you're just like, I have to bawl. Yeah. We have to know that survivors are carrying trauma with them. Mm-hmm. And so perpetrators have to carry the knowledge that they've harmed someone.
Yep.
You can't forget that. That doesn't go away. So I mentioned earlier that Esty, you can tell she's kind of heartbroken, right? Like she's crying. She understands how difficult this is for Yanki and it's still not enough, right? Mm-hmm. And at the same time, a lot of people may not understand, like, why doesn't she just go back? Like, he's clearly so sorry.
Mm-hmm. He loves her.
What if things are different?
She needs to give him a chance.
But after growing so much, can Esty, after leaving a community and discovering so much of herself, especially in such a short amount of time, can Esty ever really go back, even if accountability was there?
I don't think so, right? Because I think then you start talking about how environments shape people's behavior. So here we are in Berlin in the show, and that is a completely different environment than Esty and Yanki have ever engaged with each other in. So what happens in Berlin in a hotel by themselves without their community around is really no indicator of what it's going to be like suddenly again back steeped in the system which created and fuels and continues to shape Yanki and his treatment of her and the system's treatment of her. Mm-hmm. Right? We talk about this a lot, very specifically when we talk about addiction or addictive behaviors, that if you go get clean, but then go right back to where the physical environment where you were using, the likelihood that you stay clean is so low, not because there's some kind of willpower that you lose, but because the ability to sustain growth in the same environment which supported you before you grew is near impossible. Esty going back to Williamsburg with Yanki benefits Yanki in a way that it will never benefit Esty. Because there's no guarantee that the growth that he is symbolically trying to show her he started is going to continue. The community will not want it to continue because growing in the way that Esty would need him to grow means growing away from everything he's known and loved. I don't even want to think about what Yanki's mom would do.
Yeah.
And I think ultimately, like, we would see Esty start to have or be put in more and more positions where she has to make the same choice she made in the conception of their child. What is going to hurt me the least? She would be forever scapegoated for the fact that he is rebelling or has rebelled or did rebel, whatever you want to say about that. And ultimately, like, she would have to choose again to stay or to go, to continue to push him to grow as his catalyst, because there's no guarantee that he would stay that way, which is harmful to her, or leave again, which is harmful to her. Like it's the same like choice over and over and over again. And I think Esty recognizes that if she wants something truly different, then she has to go with something truly different.
Absolutely. And something that I also kind of want to add about those dynamics and those systems, especially like for our listeners who are students, something I think about a lot is, especially if you currently are a student who's not living at home and you go back home for maybe the holidays or over the weekends, something that you may be noticing is is the way that you fall back into your family patterns and your family dynamics. It's not something that you normally recognize when you're in those dynamics all the time, but coming back really highlights those. And then suddenly people are like, why am I fighting with my sibling like I'm literally 5 years old? Like, I promise I'm 22, I have my stuff together, and I want to bite my sibling. Right? Like, so that might be a good way to think about the ways that we fall into dynamics and the ways that our environment, even when we know, like, hey, this is not useful, this is not helpful. So even if Yankee understood exactly what was happening, which it doesn't show that he understands the level of control that Esty has a problem with.
Yeah.
So even if he did understand that, he will almost 100% fall into those patterns, especially because they benefit him so deeply.
Yeah. And I think that, first of all, that example is awesome. That you're right. You're absolutely right. And I feel like everyone listening can listen to that and be like, oh yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about. But I think it also highlights the fact that if growth is going to be sustained in a system, the entire system has to agree and has to be as committed to the change as the single person, right?
Absolutely. Well, I think that also ties into like police brutality and the systemic violence within the United States right now.
Yes.
As much as everyone wants to say like it's a few bad apples, people seem to forget that the rest of that idiom is that a few bad apples spoil the barrel. That when we protect people who are killing, we are complicit. That we are endorsing that behavior, and
Yes.
that's why we need a complete systemic overhaul.
You're absolutely right. You know, and I think that until such time as the entire system agrees that massive change needs to be enacted, what that change looks like and what accountability looks like, we won't see a change.
Yeah. Yes. Forgiveness needs to come from those that are harmed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and not be demanded.
And not be demanded, and needs to actually address that harm.
Yeah. I think going back to Esty for just 1 minute, I think what's interesting is that you do see, like you said at the beginning of our conversation about this, you do see her have compassion and empathy for where Yankee is at. And I really want to highlight that that's not a betrayal, and that doesn't somehow negate the harm that was caused or the harm that she's feeling or the righteous anger she may feel, right? Again, nuance. You can have care and compassion and empathy for the person who harmed you and the discomfort that they're experiencing in their pursuit of growth while still feeling harmed, right? Like those two things can exist simultaneously.
Yes. Yes. And I think that's something that a lot of people have issues with when it comes to our field in general. A lot of people really don't understand why survivors still hold some sort of positive feeling for someone who's harmed them. If you've never been in that situation, you'll never truly understand the dynamics of that. It is absolutely possible to love someone who has harmed you. And that when we ask survivors to completely write off someone, we're also telling survivors that you are not redeemable until you engage with how you've been harmed the way that we decide you should.
You're right.
It's more control being enacted on that person, and then we end up replicating the systems that we hate so much.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that we can arbitrarily say are wrong, and yet we continue to support them.
At the end of the day, ultimately, forgiveness is always about the survivor. It's always about the people who were harmed. And we hope that if someone is a perpetrator and willing to engage in a process of accountability, that they are going to take the information that they gain from that to truly invest in themselves so that they are not perpetrating this behavior in the future.
I think something that I just want to share to that point is that sometimes we have folks who've enacted harm call us and say, like, can I see you? Do you have programs to help people with anger management or offender treatment programs and things like that? And the first thing I'll say is we don't. And the reason we don't is not because we don't believe in them or believe in the idea of redemption or change, but because literally our grants don't allow us to. The way that we're funded, we have to only serve survivors of harm. That being said, we're always happy to get those calls and to give resources to folks who are looking honestly for those resources. The first thing we always say is seek out some counseling. There's a lot to unpack. in trying to figure out why these behaviors continue, even if you have a part of your mind or your brain or yourself that knows it's wrong. Start with counseling. Good on you for recognizing that there's change that needs to be done and for pursuing that change, because that's difficult, and that is truly how you obtain forgiveness, is by truly engaging with change.
And thank you. Yes, we're always happy to make sure that folks who are looking to take accountability for their actions, we're always happy to connect them to the right resource for them. But just as you said, we're unable to serve them with our own services. So I really do appreciate that addition. Thank you.
Yeah.
So thank you so much again, Megan, for helping us as a community kind of understand a little bit more about Unorthodox. It's been really, really helpful and enlightening for me. I feel like I've understood a lot more things I've been curious about with Jewish culture. So in addition to unpacking a situation that deserves a lot of attention, because it really gets into a lot of the nuances that we often see, it was also wonderfully educational for cultural reasons. Thank you.
Well, I'm happy to do it. I really appreciate you and all of your questions, and all the listeners really for joining us as we have unpacked Unorthodox for the last month, trying to really dig into this stuff. I think that is the crux of critical media literacy, and I'm really, really happy to be a part of it. What are we up to next in the podcast, Em?
Yeah, so we have a couple of different episodes coming up, and so we're still figuring out the order of it. So I want to say that we'll be covering Unbelievable. We will be talking about Black survivorship and the state of it on campus. And another topic that we are hoping to focus on very soon is how, if you choose to maintain a relationship with your family, how do you set up boundaries to make sure that you're protecting your mental health?
I also want to highlight really fast that we're going to be doing an episode with Assistant Vice Chancellor Kushmiter and our Advocacy Services Program Manager about their recent article in CU Today about the fact that it's okay to not be okay when we're in the middle of a pandemic.
So those are all awesome topics that we're really excited about. And if you're looking for anything else around interpersonal violence, oppression, please reach out. We are always happy to take suggestions, especially if you're thinking about different media, different articles, different systemic issues. Please remember that the Phoenix Center remains open. 24/7 helpline is 303-556-2255. So please call. You can set up an appointment as well as reach an advocate 24/7 at that line. We're also going to put a few links in the description. So check all that out. If you are able to, please donate as you see fit to different causes around the country. And please subscribe, share, and 5 stars.
Join us next week as we discuss with Assistant Vice Chancellor Kristen Kushmiter and our Advocacy Services Program Manager Catherine Miller their recent article in CU Today about coping during a global pandemic.